Chapter 11, Part 2 of The Deluge, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. The Deluge, Volume 1, by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Translated by Jeremiah Curtin. Chapter 11, Part 2. The council of war was held, in fact, and the voevoda of Poznan presided. That was a strange council. Those very dignitaries took part in it who knew nothing of war, for the magnates of Great Poland did not and could not follow the example of those kinglets of Lithuania or the Ukraine, who lived in continual fire like salamanders. In Lithuania or the Ukraine, whoever was a voevoda or a chancellor was a leader whose armor pressed out on his body red stripes which never left it, whose youth was spent in the steppes or the forests on the eastern border, in ambushes, battles, struggles, pursuits, in camp or in tabors. In Great Poland at this time dignitaries were in office who, though they had marched in times of necessity with the general militia, had never held positions of command in time of war. Profound peace had put to sleep the military courage of the descendants of those warriors before whom in former days the iron legions of the Knights of the Cross were unable to stand, and turned them into civilians, scholars, and writers. Now the stern school of Sweden was teaching them what they had forgotten. The dignitaries assembled in council looked at one another with uncertain eyes, and each feared to speak first, waiting for what Agamemnon, voevoda of Poznan, would say. But Agamemnon himself knew simply nothing, and began his speech again with complaints of the ingratitude and sloth of the king, of the frivolity with which all Great Poland and they were delivered to the sword. But how eloquent was he, what a majestic figure did he present, worthy in truth of a Roman senator. He held his head erect while speaking, his dark eyes shot lightnings, his mouth thunderbolts, his iron gray beard trembled with excitement when he described the future misfortunes of the land. "For in what does the fatherland suffer," said he, "if not in its sons? And we here suffer, first of all. Through our private lands, through our private fortunes won by the services and blood of our ancestors, will advance the feet of those enemies who now like a storm are approaching from the sea. And why do we suffer? For what will they take our herds, trample our harvest, burn our villages built by our labor? Have we wronged Radzieyovski, who condemned unjustly, hunted like a criminal, had to seek the protection of strangers? No. Do we insist that that empty title King of Sweden, which has cost so much blood already, should remain with the signature with our Yan Kazimir? No. 2 wars are blazing on our 2 boundaries. Was it needful to call forth a third? Who was to blame? May God, may the country judge him. We wash our hands, for we are innocent of the blood which will be shed." And thus the voevoda thundered on further, but when it came to the question in hand he was not able to give the desired advice. They sent then for the captains leading the land infantry, and specially for Vladyslav Skorashevski, who was not only a famous and incomparable knight, but an old practiced soldier, knowing war as he did the Lord's Prayer. In fact, genuine leaders listened frequently to his advice; all the more eagerly was it sought for now. Pan Skorashevski advised them to establish 3 camps, at Piła, Wielunie, and Ujście, so near one another that in time of attack they might give mutual aid, and besides this to cover with trenches the whole extent of the river bank occupied by the half circle of camps which were to command the passage. "When we know," said Skorashevski, "the place where the enemy will attempt the crossing, we shall unite from all 3 camps and give him proper resistance. But I, with the permission of your great mighty lordships, will go with a small party to Chaplinko. That is a lost position, and in time I shall withdraw from it, but there I shall first get knowledge of the enemy, and then will inform your great mighty lordships." All accepted this counsel, and men began to move around somewhat more briskly in the camp. At last the nobles assembled to the number of 15,000. The land infantry dug trenches over an extent of 6 miles. Ujście, the chief position, was occupied by the voevoda of Poznan and his men. A part of the knights remained in Vyelunie, a part in Pila, and Vladyslav Skorashevski went to Chaplinko to observe the enemy. July began. All the days were clear and hot. The sun burned on the plains so violently that the nobles hid in the woods between the trees, under the shade of which some of them gave orders to set up their tents. There also they had noisy and boisterous feasts, and still more of an uproar was made by the servants, especially at the time of washing and watering the horses, which, to the number of several thousand at once, were driven thrice each day to the Notets and Berda, quarreling and fighting for the best approach to the bank. But in the beginning there was a good spirit in the camp; only the voevoda of Poznan himself acted rather to weaken it. If Wittemberg had come in the first days of July, it is likely that he would have met a mighty resistance, which in proportion as the men warmed to battle might have been turned into an invincible rage, of which there were often examples. For still there flowed knightly blood in the veins of these people, though they had grown unaccustomed to war. Who knows if another Yeremi Vishnyovyetski might not have changed Uistsie in another Zbaraj, and described in those trenches a new illustrious career of knighthood? Unfortunately, the voevoda of Poznan was a man who could only write; he knew nothing of war. Wittemberg, a leader knowing not merely war but men, did not hasten, perhaps on purpose. Experience of long years had taught him that a newly enrolled soldier is most dangerous in the first moments of enthusiasm, and that often not bravery is lacking to him, but soldierly endurance, which practice alone can develop. More than once have new soldiers struck like a storm on the oldest regiments and passed over their corpses. They are iron, which while it is hot quivers, lives, scatters sparks, burns, destroys, but which when it grows cold is a mere lifeless lump. In fact, when a week had passed, a second, and the third had come, long inactivity began to weigh upon the general militia. The heat became greater each day. The nobles would not go to drill, and gave as excuse that their horses, tormented by flies, would not stand in line; and as to marshy places, they could not live from mosquitoes. Servants raised greater and greater quarrels about shady places, concerning which it came to sabres among their masters. This or that one, coming home in the evening from the water, rode off to one side from the camp, never to return. Evil example from above was also not wanting. Pan Skorashevski had given notice from Chaplinko that the Swedes were not distant, when at the military council Zygmunt Grodzynski got leave to go home. On this leave his uncle Andrzej Grodzynski, voevoda of Kalisz, had greatly insisted. "I have to lay down my head and my life here," said he. "Let my nephew inherit after me my memory and glory, so that my services may not be lost." Then he grew tender over the youth and innocence of his nephew, praising the liberality with which he had furnished 100 very choice soldiers, and the military council granted the prayer of the uncle. On the morning of July 16, Zygmunt, with a few servants, left the camp openly for home, on the eve almost of a siege and a battle. Crowds of nobles conducted him amid jeering cries to a distance beyond the camp. Ostrushka led the party, and shouted from afar after the departing, "Worthy Pan Zygmunt, I gave thee a shield, and as third name Deest. Deest means lacking. Vivat Deest Grudzinski! But weep not for thy uncle," continued Ostrushka. "He despises the Swedes as much as thou, and let them only show themselves, he will surely turn his back on them." The blood of the young magnate rushed to his face, but he pretended not to hear the insults. He put spurs to his horse, however, and pushed aside from the crowds, so as to be away from the camp and his persecutors as soon as possible, who at last, without consideration for the birth and dignity of the departing, began to throw clods of earth at him and to cry, "Here is a gruda, Grudzinski! You hare, you coward!" The name Grudzinski is derived from gruda, clod. They made such an uproar that the voevoda of Poznan hastened up with a number of captains to quiet them, and explain that Grudzinski had taken leave only for a week on very urgent affairs. Still the evil example had its effect. And that same day there were several hundred nobles who did not wish to be worse than Grudzinski, though they slipped away with less aid and more quietly. Stanisław Skshetuski, a captain from Kalisz and cousin of the famous Yan of Zbaraj, tore the hair on his head, for his land infantry, following the example of officers, began to desert from the camp. A new council of war was held, in which crowds of nobles refused absolutely to take part. A stormy night followed, full of shouts and quarrels. They suspected one another of the intention to desert. Cries of "either all or none" flew from mouth to mouth. Every moment reports were given out that the voevodas were departing, and such an uproar prevailed that the voevodas had to show themselves several times to the excited multitude. A number of thousands of men were on their horses before daybreak. But the voevoda of Poznan rode between the ranks with uncovered head like a Roman senator, and repeated from moment to moment the great words, "Worthy gentlemen, I am with you to live and die." He was received in some places with vivats, in others shouts of derision were thundering. The moment he had pacified the crowds he returned to the council, tired, hoarse, carried away by the grandeur of his own words, and convinced that he had rendered inestimable service to his country that night. But at the council he had fewer words in his mouth, twisted his beard, and pulled his foretop from despair, repeating, "Give counsel if you can. I wash my hands of the future, for it is impossible to make a defense with such soldiers." "Serene, great, mighty voevoda," answered Stanisław Skshetuski, "the enemy will drive away that turbulence and uproar. Only let the cannons play, only let it come to defense, to a siege, these very nobles in defense of their own lives must serve on the ramparts and not be disorderly in camp. So it has happened more than once. With what can we defend ourselves? We have no cannon, nothing but saluting pieces good to fire off in time of a feast. At Zbaraj Khmyelnitski had 70 cannon, and Prince Yeremi only a few 8-pounders and mortars." "But he had an army, not militia, his own squadrons, famed in the world, not country nobles fresh from sheep shearing." "Send for Pan Skorashevski," said the Castellan of Poznan; "make him commander of the camp. He is at peace with the nobles, and will be able to keep them in order." "Send for Skorashevski? Why should he be in Drachim or Chaplinko?" repeated Jędrzej Grudzinski, the voevoda of Kalisz. "Yes, that is the best counsel," cried other voices. A courier was dispatched for Skorashevski. No other decisions were taken at the council, but they talked much, and complained of the king, the queen, the lack of troops, and negligence. The following morning brought neither relief nor calm spirits. The disorder had become still greater. Some gave out reports that the dissidents, namely the Calvinists, were favorable to the Swedes, and ready on the first occasion to go over to the enemy. What was more, this news was not contradicted by Pan Schlichting, nor by Edmund and Jacek Kurnatovski, also Calvinists, but sincerely devoted to the country. Besides, they gave final proof that the dissidents formed a separate circle, and consulted with one another under the lead of a noted disturber and cruel man, Pan Rey, who, serving in Germany during his youth as a volunteer on the Lutheran side, was a great friend of the Swedes. Scarcely had this suspicion gone out among the nobles when several thousand sabres were gleaming, and a real tempest rose in the camp. "Let us punish the traitors, punish the serpents ready to bite the bosom of their mother!" cried the nobles. "Give them this way! Cut them to pieces! Treason is most infectious, worthy gentlemen! Tear out the cockle, or we shall all perish!" The voevodas and captains had to pacify them again. But this time it was more difficult than the day before. Besides, they were themselves convinced that Rei was ready to betray his country in the most open manner, for he was a man completely foreignized, and except his language had nothing Polish in him. It was decided, therefore, to send him out of the camp, which at once pacified somewhat the angry multitude. Still shouts continued to burst forth for a long time. "Give them here! Treason! Treason!" Wonderful conditions of mind reigned finally in the camp. Some fell in courage and were sunk in grief; others walked in silence with uncertain steps along the ramparts, casting timid and gloomy glances along the plains over which the enemy had to approach, or communicated in whispers worse and worse news. Others were possessed of a sort of desperate, mad joy, and readiness for death. In consequence of this readiness, they arranged feasts and drinking bouts so as to pass the last days of life in rejoicing. Some thought of saving their souls, and spent the nights in prayer. But in that whole throng of men no one thought of victory, as if it were altogether beyond reach. Still the enemy had not superior forces; they had more cannon, better trained troops, and a leader who understood war. And while in this wise on one hand the Polish camp was seething, shouting, and feasting, rising up with a roar, dropping down to quiet like a sea lashed by a whirlwind, while the general militia were holding diets as in time of electing a king, on the other side, along the broad green meadows of the Oder, pushed forward in calmness the legions of Swedes. In front marched a brigade of the royal guard, led by Benedict Horn, a terrible soldier whose name was repeated in Germany with fear. The soldiers were chosen men, large, wearing lofty helmets with rims covering their ears, in yellow leather doublets, armed with rapiers and muskets, cool and constant in battle, ready at every beck of the leader. Karl Schedding, a German, led the West Gothland brigade, formed of 2 regiments of infantry and 1 of heavy cavalry, dressed in armor without shoulder pieces. Half of the infantry had muskets, the others spears. At the beginning of a battle the musketeers stood in front, but in case of attack by cavalry they stood behind the spearsmen, who, placing each the butt of his spear in the ground, held the point against the onrushing horses. At a battle in the time of Sigismund III., one squadron of hussars cut to pieces with their sabres and with their hoofs the same West Gothland brigade, in which at present Germans served mainly. The 2 Smaland brigades were led by Irwin, surnamed Handless, for he had lost his right hand on a time when defending his flag; but to make up for this loss he had in his left such strength that with one blow he could hew off the head of a horse. He was a gloomy warrior, loving battle and bloodshed alone, stern to himself and to soldiers. While other captains trained themselves in continual wars into followers of a craft, and loved war for its own sake, he remained the same fanatic, and while slaying men he sang psalms to the Lord. The brigade of Westmorland marched under Drakenborg, and that of Helsingor, formed of sharpshooters famed through the world, under Gustav Oxenstiern, a relative of the renowned chancellor, a young soldier who roused great hopes. Fernsen commanded the East Gothland brigade. The Nerik and Verland brigades were directed by Wittemberg himself, who at the same time was supreme chief of the whole army. 72 cannon pounded out furrows in the moist meadows. Of soldiers there were 17,000, the fierce plunderers of all Germany; and in battle they were so accurate, especially the infantry, that the French royal guard could hardly compare with them. After the regiments followed the wagons and tents. The regiments marched in line, ready each moment for battle. A forest of lances was bristling above the mass of heads, helmets, and hats; and in the midst of that forest flowed on toward the frontier of Poland the great blue banners with white crosses in the center. With each day the distance decreased between the 2 armies. At last, on July 27, in the forest at the village of Heinrichsdorf, the Swedish legions beheld for the first time the boundary pillar of Poland. At sight of this the whole army gave forth a mighty shout; trumpets and drums thundered, and all the flags were unfurled. Wittemberg rode to the front attended by a brilliant staff, and all the regiments passed before him, presenting arms, the cavalry with drawn rapiers, the cannon with lighted matches. The time was midday, the weather glorious. The forest breeze brought the odor of resin. The gray road, covered with the rays of the sun, the road over which the Swedish regiments had passed, bending out of the Heinrichsdorf forest, was lost on the horizon. When the troops marching by it had finally passed the forest, their glances discovered a gladsome land, smiling, shining with yellow fields of every kind of grain, dotted in places with oak groves, in places green from meadows. Here and there out of groups of trees, behind oak groves, and far away, rose bits of smoke to the sky. On the grass herds were seen grazing. Where on the meadows the water gleamed widely spread, walked storks at their leisure. A certain calm and sweetness was spread everywhere over that land flowing with milk and honey, and it seemed to open its arms ever wider and wider before the army, as if it greeted not invaders but guests coming with God. At this sight a new shout was wrested from the bosom of all the soldiers, especially the Swedes by blood, who were accustomed to the bare, poor, wild nature of their native land. The hearts of a plundering and needy people rose with desire to gather those treasures and riches which appeared before their eyes. Enthusiasm seized the ranks. But the soldiers, tempered in the fire of the 30 Years' War, expected that this would not come to them easily, for that grain land was inhabited by a numerous and a knightly people who knew how to defend it. The memory was still living in Sweden of the terrible defeat of Kirchholm, where 3,000 cavalry under Chodkiewicz ground into dust 18,000 of the best troops of Sweden. In the cottages of West Gotland, Smaland, and Della Carlia they told tales of those winged knights as of giants from a saga. Fresher still was the memory of the struggles in the time of Gustavus Adolphus, for the warriors were not yet extinct who had taken part in them. But that eagle of Scandinavia, ere he had flown twice through all Germany, broke his talons on the legions of Koniecpolski. Therefore with the gladness there was joined in the hearts of the Swedes a certain fear, of which the supreme chief, Wittemberg himself, was not free. He looked on the passing regiments of infantry and cavalry with the eye with which a shepherd looks on his flock. Then he turned to the rear man, who wore a hat with a feather and a light-colored wig falling to his shoulders. "Your grace assures me," said he, "that with these forces it is possible to break the army occupying Uistsie?" The man with the light wig smiled and answered, "Your grace may rely completely on my words, for which I am ready to pledge my head. If at Uistsie there were regular troops and some one of the hetmans, I would first give counsel not to hasten, but to wait till his royal grace should come with the whole army. But against the general militia and those gentlemen of Great Poland our forces will be more than sufficient." "But have not reinforcements come to them?" "Reinforcements have not come for two reasons. First, because all the regular troops, of which there are not many, are occupied in Lithuania and the Ukraine. Second, because in Warsaw neither the King Yan Kazimir, the chancellor, nor the Senate will believe to this moment that his royal grace Karl Gustav has really begun war in spite of the truce, and notwithstanding the last embassies and his readiness to compromise. They are confident that peace will be made at the last hour. Ha ha!" Here the man removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his red face, and added, "Trubetskoi and Dolgoruki in Lithuania, Khmyelnitski in the Ukraine, and we entering Great Poland. Behold what the government of Yan Kazimir has led to." Wittemberg gazed at him with a look of astonishment, and asked, "But, your grace, do you rejoice at that thought?" "I rejoice at that thought, for my wrong and my innocence will be avenged, and besides I see, as on the palm of my hand, that the sabre of your grace and my counsels will place that new and most beautiful crown in the world on the head of Karl Gustav." Wittemberg turned his glance to the distance, embraced with it the oak groves, the meadows, the grain fields, and after a while said, "True, it is a beautiful country and fertile. Your grace may be sure that after the war the king will give the chancellorship to no one else but you." The man in the rear removed his cap a second time. "And I for my part wish to have no other lord," added he, raising his eyes to heaven. The heavens were clear and fair. No thunderbolt fell and crushed to the dust the traitor who delivered his country, groaning under 2 wars already and exhausted, to the power of the enemy on that boundary. The man conversing with Wittemberg was Hieronim Radzieyovski, late under chancellor of the crown, now sold to Sweden in hostility to his country. They stood a time in silence. Meanwhile the last 2 brigades, those of Nerik and Vermland, passed the boundary. After them others began to draw in the cannon. The trumpets still played unceasingly. The roar and rattle of drums outsounded the tramp of the soldiers, and filled the forest with ominous echoes. At last the staff moved also. Radzeyovski rode at the side of Wittemberg. "Oxenstiern is not to be seen," said Wittemberg. "I am afraid that something may have happened to him. I do not know whether it was wise to send him as a trumpeter with letters to Uistsie." "It was wise," answered Radzeyovski, "for he will look at the camp, will see the leaders, and learn what they think there; and this any kind of camp follower could not do." "But if they recognize him?" "Ray alone knows him, and he is ours. Besides, even if they should recognize him, they will do him no harm, but will give him supplies for the road and reward him. I know the Poles, and I know they are ready for anything merely to show themselves polite people before strangers. Our whole effort is to win the praise of strangers. Your grace may be at rest concerning Oxenstiern, for a hair will not fall from his head. He has not come because it is too soon for his return." "And does your grace think our letters will have any effect?" Radzeyovski laughed. "If your grace permits, I will foretell what will happen. The voevoda of Poznan is a polished and learned man, therefore he will answer us very courteously and very graciously; but because he loves to pass for a Roman, his answer will be terribly Roman. He will say, to begin with, that he would rather shed the last drop of his blood than surrender; that death is better than dishonor, and the love which he bears for his country directs him to fall for her on the boundary." Radzeyovski laughed still louder. The stern face of Wittemberg brightened also. "Your grace does not think that he will be ready to act as he writes?" asked Wittemberg. "He?" answered Radzeyovski. "It is true that he nourishes a love for his country, but with ink, and that is not over strong food. His love is in fact more scant than that of his jester, who helps him to put rhymes together. I am certain that after that Roman answer will come good wishes for health, success, offers of service, and at last a request to spare his property and that of his relatives, for which again he with all his relatives will be thankful." "And what at last will be the result of our letters?" "The courage of the other side will weaken to the last degree. Senators will begin to negotiate with us, and we shall occupy all Great Poland after perhaps a few shots in the air." "Would that your grace be a true prophet!" "I am certain that it will be as I say, for I know these people. I have friends and adherents in the whole country, and I know how to begin; and that I shall neglect nothing is made sure by the wrong which I endure from Yan Kazimir and my love for Karl Gustav. People with us are more tender at present about their own fortunes than the integrity of the Commonwealth. All those lands upon which we shall now march are the estates of the Opalinskis, the Charnkovskis, the Grudzinskis, and because they are at Uistsie in person, they will be milder in negotiating. As to the nobles, if only their freedom of disputing at the diets is guaranteed, they will follow the voevodas. By knowledge of the country and the people your grace renders the king unexampled service, which cannot remain without an equally noteworthy reward. Therefore, from what you say I conclude that I may look on this land as ours." "You may, your grace, you may, you may," repeated Radzeyovski hurriedly a number of times. "Therefore I occupy it in the name of his royal grace Karl Gustav," answered Wittemberg solemnly. Chapter 12